In the early 18th century, Lexington, Massachusetts, existed as a modest farming settlement within the inland landscape west of Boston, defined by rolling fields, scattered woodlets, and a central common that structured both movement and communal life patterns daily. Established earlier as part of Cambridge farms, the community's geography shaped its development, with thin soils and mixed forests encouraging diversified agriculture, while proximity to regional roads connected residents to markets in Boston without creating dense urban concentration patterns. Households relied on family labor, cultivating corn, rye, and livestock, producing subsistence surpluses that could be traded locally, while seasonal rhythms governed work, reinforcing a stable, interdependent social order anchored in land ownership and kinship ties across generations widely. The town common functioned as both meeting place and militia ground, reflecting English colonial traditions transplanted to New England, where civic, religious, and defensive activities overlapped within shared spaces, reinforcing collective identity and mutual obligation among residents over time. Religious life centered on the Congregational Church, whose authority extended beyond worship into governance and moral regulation, shaping daily conduct and community expectations, while sermons and town meetings intertwined, reflecting the limited separation between spiritual guidance and civic administration. Population growth during the early 1700s expanded settlement patterns outward, as new farms were cleared from surrounding woodlands, altering the landscape and increasing demands on local resources, yet maintaining a dispersed rural character rather than forming concentrated village streets. Economic life remained largely agrarian, but local artisans such as blacksmiths and carpenters provided essential services, integrating a modest exchange economy that supplemented farming income, linking Lexington to wider colonial markets through periodic trade and shared craftsmanship networks regional. Roads connecting Lexington to neighboring towns in Boston followed contours, shaping travel and commerce, while seasonal conditions affected accessibility, reinforcing localized interaction patterns and limiting movement, thus preserving the community's relative isolation despite its inclusion within colonial Massachusetts. Local governance operated through town meetings, where male property holders debated taxation, land distribution, and communal responsibilities, reflecting participatory practices that balanced authority and consent, yet excluded women, servants, and enslaved individuals from formal decision-making processes within the settlement. Throughout mid-century, imperial policies began to influence local affairs indirectly, as British regulations on trade and taxation affected colonial economies, creating tensions that reached rural towns like Lexington, where awareness of distant political decisions gradually entered everyday discussion. The aftermath of conflicts such as King George's War placed financial burdens on colonies, leading to increased taxation and administrative oversight, which, although distant, contributed to a sense among Lexington residents that external authorities were reshaping established local practices. By the 1760s, measures like the Stamp Act intensified colonial resistance, and while Lexington was not a political center, its inhabitants engaged in discussions reflecting colonial concerns, illustrating how imperial policy changes permeated rural communities beyond major ports. Committees of correspondence and informal networks spread information, allowing Lexington residents to coordinate responses with neighboring towns, reinforcing a collective colonial identity that increasingly viewed British authority with skepticism, marking a shift from local concerns toward shared political consciousness. Economic pressures from imperial taxation policies disrupted established trade patterns, affecting prices and availability of goods, thereby influencing household decisions and reinforcing resistance, as economic grievances merged with political objections to create a unified framework for colonial dissent. Training of local militia units on the common reflected increasing preparation, as communities anticipated potential conflict, maintaining readiness through drills and organization, which both preserved traditional defense practices and adapted them to emerging political tensions across Massachusetts increasingly and regularly. Lexington's position along inland routes made it strategically relevant, as movements between Boston and the interior passed nearby, situating the town within a broader geographic network that would later influence military planning and communication during escalating colonial unrest. Social structures remained hierarchical interconnected, with prominent families exercising influence and governance, while ordinary farmers participated in communal decisions, creating a layered society that balanced deference with participation, a pattern characteristic of many New England towns during this period. Information circulated through sermons, printed materials, and personal correspondence, allowing ideas about rights, representation, and governance to reach Lexington, contributing to a gradual ideological shift that aligned local perspectives with broader colonial arguments against parliamentary authority over time. As tensions increased in the early 1770s, local actions such as boycotts and resolutions reflected growing resistance, demonstrating how rural communities translated abstract political disputes into concrete practices that affected daily life and reinforced collective opposition to imperial governance. Lexington's experience illustrates the interconnected nature of colonial society, where even small towns engaged with empire-wide issues, revealing how local conditions, economic practices, and geographic position combined to shape responses that contributed to the unfolding revolutionary movement wider. These developments produced social consequences, as divisions emerged between loyalist sympathizers and those advocating resistance, altering relationships within the community and introducing political tensions into previously stable networks of kinship, trade, and shared religious life increasingly visible and consequential. By 1775, Lexington stood at a threshold shaped by decades of change, where geographic realities, economic adaptations, and evolving political awareness converged, forming structural conditions that would have significance in the transformation from colonial settlement to revolutionary landscape.
By early 1775, Lexington had become increasingly attentive to developments in Boston, as British troop movements and colonial resistance heightened uncertainty, while local militia readiness intensified, reflecting a transition from political discussion toward anticipation of direct confrontation within the region. The town's militia, composed of local farmers and tradesmen, maintained regular drills on the common, ensuring preparedness, while leadership coordinated with neighboring communities, forming a decentralized defensive network that relied on rapid communication and shared expectations of collective response. Geographically, Lexington's location along key inland routes made it a point of passage between Boston and Concord, positioning it within anticipated military pathways, thereby increasing its strategic importance despite its modest size and primarily agricultural character. In April 1775, intelligence circulated that British forces intended to march toward Concord to seize colonial military supplies, prompting riders and messengers to alert surrounding towns, activating pre-existing communication systems that had developed through committees and militia coordination efforts. On the night of April 18th, signals from Boston confirmed British troop movement, and alarm riders moved through the countryside, reaching Lexington in the early hours, where militia members were summoned, gathering on the common under conditions of uncertainty and limited information. Captain John Parker, leading the Lexington militia, faced the challenge of organizing a response without clear knowledge of British intentions, balancing caution with readiness, as the assembled men represented both the town's defense and its symbolic resistance to imperial authority. At dawn on April 19th, British troops approached Lexington, advancing along the main road, their objective directed toward Concord, yet their passage through Lexington brought them into direct contact with the assembled militia, creating a moment of confrontation shaped by miscommunication. The exact sequence of events remains debated, but a shot was fired, initiating a brief exchange of gunfire, resulting in casualties among the Lexington militia, marking one of the first instances of armed conflict between British forces and colonial militias. The engagement on Lexington Green was short in duration but significant in consequence, as it transformed political tensions into open conflict, demonstrating that disputes over governance and taxation had escalated into violence within colonial communities. Following the encounter, British troops continued toward Concord, while news of the clash spread rapidly, mobilizing additional militia forces across the region, illustrating the effectiveness of colonial communication networks and the readiness of local populations to respond collectively. Lexington's experience that morning reflected broader colonial dynamics, where local autonomy and imperial authority collided, producing immediate violence and long-term implications for governance, allegiance, and the structure of political relationships across Massachusetts and beyond. The economic implications of the conflict became evident as normal agricultural and trade activities were disrupted, with resources redirected towards supporting militia efforts, altering household priorities and reinforcing the integration of local economies into wartime conditions. In the days following the battle, Lexington became part of a wider theater of conflict as colonial forces organized siege lines around Boston, transforming the region into a sustained zone of military activity, affecting mobility, supply chains, and civilian life. Social consequences emerged as the community absorbed the impact of casualties and the realities of war, strengthening solidarity among supporters of resistance while diminishing space for loyalist perspectives, thereby reshaping internal dynamics and community